Welcome to Prince Michigan, the video cast for people who are going to be shot by all sides when the revolution comes. This is a weekly video cast and one which I begin with an investigation of racial killings in the US. This is a hot topic at the moment because of the recent killing of George Floyd, and I'm intrigued by the claims made by Black Lives Matter and those that oppose Black Lives Matter. And I'm going to look at both sides of the equation here and see what is actually going on. Here is a graph of the number of people killed at the hands of police over a several-year period. The data is taken from Kaggle.com, the link of which is below. The graph shows 1,200 people, white people, were killed over the period in question, about 600 black people, and about 30 Asians. Bear in mind that this data is absolute, so doesn't take into account the various ratios of each racial group in society. So the first thing we must do if we are to examine the existence or not of racial bias is to look at these ratios. So for example, we must take into account the fact that white people are about 60% of the population, black people about 13%, and Asians about 6%. When we do this, and we scale the previous data we saw, we find that in line with Black Lives Matter's claim that black people are about twice as likely to be killed at the hands of police than white people, and 5 or 6 times as likely to be killed by police as Asians. Now, the interesting thing is that in the eyes of Black Lives Matter, what we've just seen now is the only context required to elucidate bias. In other words, we just need to know the number of people killed and the racial breakdown of people in each group to know for sure whether bias exists. And if it doesn't exist, we should expect to see no difference between the heights of these bars. Now, this is an intriguing assumption to begin with, because if we apply it to other fields, we find some interesting observations. For example, here is the breakdown of deaths at the hands of police by gender. And what we see is that men are 23 times more likely to be killed by police than women are. Now, if we are to apply the Black Lives Matter rationale, then there is a war against men. And that this is proof in and of itself of unfair and in fact horrific gender bias in killing. So the question is, well, is it appropriate to just stop there, or should we be looking at other levels of context in order to make sense of this data? And we can do that. We can look at an extra layer. We can, for example, ask the question of, well, who of these two groups in front of us are more likely to kill police themselves? And the answer, of course, is that men are far more likely to kill police than women are, and therefore it is perhaps unsurprising that men are themselves killed more often by police. And when we scale this data in front of us by this context, so risk posed to police versus risk of dying by police, we see that men are in no way overrepresented. In fact, on the contrary, it seems women are disproportionately likely to die at the hands of police, despite posing far less of a risk to police. If we apply this same rationale as I have just presented for gender back to race, what we find is a similar reconfiguring of bias. In fact, we see that whites and Asians are in fact disproportionately targeted compared to black people, when taking into account this third context of risk to police. So I'm going to stop there now and just point out that we can actually draw whatever conclusion that we want to from this data, depending on what our starting premises are. So, for example, if we assume to begin with that demographic disparities alone are proof of bias, then we immediately infer that black people are unfairly targeted, and we should infer that men are also unfairly targeted. If we begin with the assumption that we need to know two things, that is, the demographic disparities and the risk posed to police at the same time, then we will conclude precisely the opposite. We will conclude no police bias against black people and the existence of police bias against whites and Asians. We can begin with the third assumption that neither demographic disparity nor risk posed to police are necessarily enough, in which case we must conclude that we cannot say either way that there is or isn't police bias against any group. We just, in that context, decide that we need to hunt for more information before we can be certain of anything. So it's worth noting I don't have any answers here. What I do know is that all sides, whether or not you believe that racial killings are proof of systemic bias, whether or not you take that to be true or whether or not you take the converse to be true, just depends on your starting assumptions. And my hope is that people will start to question their assumptions and to have meaningful discussions about what is actually happening without the existence of sacred cows, because it seems that many sides now have sacred cows and have assumptions which they don't just regard as assumptions but as self-evident truths which cannot and should not be questioned. Thank you for listening. If you have any comments, I look forward to reading them below, and I will get back to you. Thank you.